The library was my space, and there was just so much.
To the Harbor Grace excursion with the boys to have a time.
Thank you very much. And thank you all for coming. And it's a great pleasure to be in conversation with Keiron Pim.
It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you.
So, to jump right in, it's interesting as part of a Jewish heritage series because Joseph Roth was so conflicted about his Jewishness, but we will get to that later. Joseph Roth was born in Brody. At the time, it was a town at the easternmost edge of the Habsburg Empire, very near to the border with Russia. What significance did this place have for Roth's sense of personal identity?
Yeah, good question. It was absolutely fundamental. I mean, it shaped him in so many ways. I think maybe the first thing to say about Brody was that it was a place it was synonymous with all that was kind of looked down upon in Galicia. Poverty, squalor, illiteracy. It was somewhere that people further west kind of thought of as synonymous with all that the worst connotations that they saw associated with Galicia, but it was also a rich center of Jewish learning. It was fundamental to the Jewish Enlightenment. It was somewhere that shaped him in so many ways. And those two ways, I think the two key ways, were one, that he internalized a lot of shame associated with being from somewhere that was seen as like the back of beyond, somewhere that you wouldn't, if you had aspirations, social aspirations, it wasn't somewhere that you would let on you were from. But also, because he grew up in such a Jewish environment, his grandfather, Yechiel Grubel, for example, was a devout, pious Jew. And
so, a devout bias?
So
a pious
Jew. He was,
because it was also a Hasidic. There was a lot of Hasidic.
Yeah, and these ideas, the beliefs of the Hasidim, really kind of soaked into Joseph Roth as a boy, as a young man. So those kind of ideas, which we might see now as irrational, kind of mystical, stayed with him through his life. But also he was keen from very early on, certainly as a young man, to get away, to make something of himself. And he had his sights set on Vienna from kind of teenage years onwards. There are letters that he wrote around the time that he was finishing secondary school, the gymnasium, where he's basically saying, I can't wait to get away. But as we'll see, having got away, the place would always loom large for him, whether he was physically proximate to it or not.
I mean, in his most famous novel, the Radetzky March, he writes, any strangers who came to this part of the world were slowly but irresistibly doomed. No one was a match for the swamp. No one could stand up to the border. And when you were talking about people looking down on it, I think you quote Roth's observation that the more Western the origins of the Jew, the more Jews you had there are for you to look down upon. So Frankfurt despises those from Berlin, who despise the Viennese, who despise the ones from Warsaw, and everyone looks down on the Jews from Galicia, the lowest of the low. But before we talk about Brody's role in Roth's fiction, tell me about the family he was born into, starting with his father, Nahum Roth.
Well, the father, or the absence of his father, again, is fundamental. Don't know very much about him, but what we do know is that he went insane before Joseph Roth was born. The story that was handed down was that, well, we know that he was a grain merchant, a grain salesman. He would travel back and forth across Central and Eastern Europe. It appears that he had quite a large amount of grain stolen from him. He was mortified about this, terrified, went back to tell his employer, tried to pacify them, was kind of rocketing back and forth, trying to find this missing grain. And this seems to have tipped him over the edge, and he seems to have gone insane on a train heading back towards, I think it was Silesia, and he was kind of manhandled off the train onto the platform, and then put into a psychiatric institution, and then from there taken into the care of a wonder rabbi who it was hoped would cure him, but never did. And at this point, his wife, Maria Roth, née Grubel, was already pregnant with their son, who he would never meet.
And he ended up living with the wonder rabbi for the rest of his life.
Supposedly he lived with the wonder rabbi for the remainder of his life, which was another 16 years or so. But Joseph Roth would never meet the father. And so this search for fathers, I mean, anyone who's read his books will see that theme arising again and again. Either characters searching for lost fathers or these kind of powerful father figures who loom large in the stories. And also in his own life, we can see a search for father figures. I think there are 2 or 3 main ways that I identified him doing that. One was his reverence for the emperor, Franz Joseph, this kind of looming paternal figure who ruled over Austria-Hungary. Another would be, and we're going to...
That would be quite a remote father figure.
Yes, but maybe they're the safest kind, and maybe they don't let you down so easily. But
was Roth fearful that he himself might have a mental breakdown? I mean, the fact that he
absolutely.
had, because there's one quote where he says that he never met his father, but he owes him his depression or his
melancholy.
His specialty was the melancholy, which I inherited from him.
Yes.
But how did he even know that his father was melancholic? I mean,
I can only imagine that it was spoken of within the family that, you know, this man, this is what he was like, and you may have inherited certain predispositions from him. But yeah, I mean, the question of insanity, it looms over his whole life. There was the father he never knew, who he lost to insanity. Then later, and we'll talk about his wife, Friedel. But also the question, the idea that he would go insane himself, haunted him, tortured him. Some would say that he did, although he was never certified as such. But certainly in the depths of his drinking, he was not sane, put it like that.
You started saying there were other father figures that besides
Yeah,
Franz Joseph?
I mean, so we have Franz Joseph. I mean, people may know that he was someone who was at his most comfortable living in hotels. He lived most of his adult life in hotels. And one of the things that hotels supplied for him, I think, was a ready-made family wherever he went. And there's quite often references in his writing about hotels to, for example, the concierge or the porter. The porter greets me like a father figure, that kind of thing. He's always looking for, you know, solid, stable men wherever he went who would kind of support him. The third example that comes to mind is in connection with his Catholicism. And again, priests, fathers, father, whoever, who he would pray to, who he would confess to, and the Heavenly Father as well. So he was looking for fathers, substitute fathers, wherever he went, really. I say something near the beginning of the book about willing his lost father into reality, or finding substitutes, both real and fictional, was a preoccupation that would last his entire life. It really shaped him. Yeah.
What do we know about Roth's mother, Maria Grubel?
Well, without wishing to sound trite, it was almost a case of her being the opposite of the father, and that the father was absent, and in Joseph Roth's view, she was all too present. She was, and I think this is understandable, she'd lost her husband to insanity. She only had the one child. She didn't want to lose him, so she barely let him out of her sight. There's this story that she would walk him to elementary school and then stay there the whole school day waiting for him, and then walk him back home again, kind of holding his hand. She would walk him to secondary school until the point came where he said, "Mother, no more." You know, there are figures throughout his fiction, kind of rather domineering maternal figures who his friend Sommer Morgenstern said, for example, that in one of Roth's best-known novels, Job, he said that the wife of the main character, Deborah Singer, basically what was Maria Grubel. But we see this kind of archetype, this kind of maternal, fearsome, intimidating, all-encompassing figure popping up again and again in his fiction. It was as if he couldn't see past her. She was everywhere he looked. She didn't like him having friends to visit at home. He had to spend, his time with her. And so she seems to have had a trait that he inherited from her, which was that to try to prevent people that she loved, or the son that she loved dearly, to avoid losing him, she tried to keep him within her sights, pin him down. And of course, that's entirely counterproductive. So as soon as he could, he got away from Brody. He moved, first of all, to the University of Lemberg, but then quickly onto the University of Vienna. He wanted really very little more to do with her. He felt that in order to establish his own freedom, he had to shuck off his mother, basically.
And she brought up her son to be German, or rather an Austro-German. What did that mean?
To be an Austro-German, well,
Yeah,
to be, yeah.
I mean, she's growing up in, let's say, a Yiddish community, a Yiddish-speaking world, but the focus with him was to be. I mean, that's how he managed to go to Lemberg, Lviv, Lvov. I mean, these the same town under different border shifts, but
well, so Joseph Roth's year at school at the gymnasium, the Crown Prince Rudolf Gymnasium, was the last year to be taught in German. After that, the Poles who wanted to reassert their culture, which had been rather suppressed under Habsburg rule, they managed to reassert young people being taught in Polish. But as Roth was growing up, German was the language in which he was taught, and it was the language that was seen as the language of the apex of civilization, really. And for an ambitious family, such as they were, I mean, although they were impoverished, they were middle class, kind of genteel, kind of poverty-stricken, if you like, always somewhere near the margins, but not, they sometimes had a maid. He had violin lessons, anyway, that's a slightly roundabout way of saying they had social aspirations, and German was the language of high culture. And he was brought up to be oriented towards German culture, German literature, German poetry, which he saw as, Schiller, Goethe. These were the gods. This is what he was oriented towards.
So I mean, Roth, as you're saying, Roth turned his back on his mother as soon as he could, and he once wrote of the eternal law of nature that forces mothers and sons to become strangers, ever more strangers. Was he trying to rationalize his own indifference or antipathy to his mother?
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think he wanted to make it seem that this was somehow inevitable, that sons and mothers just drift apart and don't have much to do with each other. Well, it doesn't have to be that way. He wrote that, I think, not long after she died. She died in 1922, which was a pivotal year because she died in March 1922. He married Friedel about 5 days later. And it was a very decisive transference of affections, I think.
Because he had met Friedel, or Frederica Friedel-Reichler, who also turned out to be a landsman from Galicia. But he had, just before we get to her, if you can generalize for a moment, I mean, Roth clearly had difficult relations with women, and the one with Friedel might have been the saddest. But without getting too Freudian, how much do you think his feelings for his mother shaped his relationships with women?
I think it's very easy to get Freudian when you're talking about this, because I think, I mean, it's absolutely, really shaped it fundamentally as far as I can see. I think in two respects. One was that, as I alluded to, this need to control,
Mm-hmm.
to pin people down for fear of losing them. But of course, it's counterproductive. And we see this again and again in his adult relationships with women, that he wouldn't let them out of his sight. He wanted to shape them into his idea of what a woman should be, kind of a ladylike figure. You know, he broke one woman after another by doing that. It was terrible.
Isn't that peculiar, given that he was the victim of that kind of possessiveness, that he would then enact that, use it as a role model for relations? I mean,
Well, it is, but he was peculiar.
Yeah, but-
The other aspect is that he was so, well, I mean, the ways in which he behaved towards women, he basically wanted them to mother him, and his mother being so solicitous, doting on him, being, you know, he seemed to want the women in his life to do that, and he had, as I say, these kind of very fixed ideas about how women should tend to men and kind of flit around him and, you know, cater to his every need. It's not appealing stuff at all. I mean, you know, I think the one thing, the main thing in the course of researching this biography, you always find something else about a biographical subject that you kind of think, if I'd known this at the beginning, would I have found them so appealing? And his attitude towards women, in the end, what I concluded was his misogyny was that, really. I mean, as his life goes on, he says worse and worse things about women. Really, it's appalling at times. Yeah.
But he remained attractive to them. But we can get to that. Well, so with Friedel, it was in Vienna that he met Friedel. She was attractive, affectionate, but about 6 years after they married, which, as you were saying, was just at a pivotal moment just after his mother died, she began to suffer from mental health issues. Roth blamed himself. He spent a lot of his resources, a lot of his money on treatment. How responsible do you think he was?
It's a really vexed question, and it was one of the questions that haunted him. Initially, he dismissed the idea that he was responsible. Then he wholeheartedly bought into Friedel's view that he was responsible. And later, having discussed it a great deal with medics and psychiatrists, he accepted that he wasn't wholly responsible. I think it's hard to give a definitive answer because it was hard enough at the time for doctors to actually give a definitive diagnosis. It's thought that she succumbed to a version of schizophrenia of some kind. We know that schizophrenia has a genetic predisposition. There can be environmental factors as well that will trigger this latent predisposition. But to disentangle the various strands of mental ill health that Friedel was experiencing by the late 1920s is impossible at this distance. I mean, so this was what seems to have been schizophrenia. But also, I mean, she always was anxious. She was a timid, anxious, kind of sweet young woman, inherently like that. When he met her, he was charmed by that. And again, we come back to the idea of father figures. He seemed to rather liked the idea of being paternal towards her. He would describe her as his little girl, who, you know, he was 6 years older than her, which, you know, at that kind of age, when she was 19, 20, it's a big gap. How did I get to that?
How responsible he was.
How responsible he was, sorry, yes. So there was anxiety. She had a kind of anxious predisposition, but there's also circumstantial historical factors as well. In the course of researching the book, I spoke with an American historian named Darcy Burkle, who was a great help to me because her specialism is in Jewish women's mental health in Vienna in the 1920s. One of my great discoveries while researching the book was
a gold mine.
Absolutely. The specificity of academic disciplines is absolutely wonderful. So she gave me the lowdown on the kind of factors that would have been playing on mental health of women such as Friedel at that time. And there were generational tensions. So, for example, women of her age tended to have more ambitions than their parents, who were kind of more orthodox, more, you know, constrained, and would have certain reservations about their children trying to spread their wings. There were tensions there. But also, of course, we're talking about Vienna in the early to mid 1920s, and you can't get away from the impact of burgeoning anti-Semitism. So you have those factors that were playing on her mental health, and then you have a marriage such as she had to Joseph Roth, which was destructive for her. Really, he was the last kind of man that she needed. She needed stability, she needed calm, she needed support. And what she got was a man who lived out of 3 suitcases, was only ever happy when he was on the move, lived in hotels, lived from one cash pay packet to the next, and had a drink problem, which accelerated as her mental health degenerated as well. The two went hand in hand.
Just to briefly mention what happened to her at the end is it only came to light in 2011.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, so she died in the Shoah. Because she was a psychiatric patient, more than because she was Jewish. Yes, she died in a gas chamber as part of the Action T4, the euthanasia, as they termed it, of psychiatric patients. This was in 1940, so after Roth had died. Yep, it's devastating. Yeah.
To go back to Brody for a moment, which Roth rarely did, how did that location come to play a role in his fiction? I mean, you say somewhere that Brody is everywhere and nowhere. Never was he anywhere specific apart from the place in Joseph Roth's mind where memory met imagination. I mean, how did that work?
Well, as Friedel's mental health declined, as nationalism and Nazism came into the ascendant, as Roth's world started to collapse around him, we see in his fiction a decisive switch in the late 1920s between these novels, which were part of a genre known as Heimkehrer Romane, homecoming novels, homecomer novels, which were again and again about soldiers returning from the war and finding that contemporary society no longer really offered them a home. They tried to come home, they found that society had changed in their absence, and so had they. Now, as his world started to fall apart, he moved from writing these novels that were a mirror to contemporary society into novels that tended to be more set in the past, and which were in more of a dream world that he cultivated. And it was a kind of nostalgic and yet at the same time satirized version of the Austria-Hungary and the Galicia that he grew up in. And time and again, we see the protagonists in these novels being sent out to small towns on the periphery of Austria-Hungary, which are basically thinly disguised versions of Brody. They tend to have different names. In Weights and Measures, it's Swabi. In The Emperor's Tomb, it's Slottergrad. In the Radetzky March, it's only referred to as B as in Brody, I guess, but B, 4 points. But he does it again and again. In the book, I say it's best just to think of it as he termed it in his non-fiction book, The Wandering Jews, the little town. And so the quote that you just mentioned about the shtetl being somewhere where his memory met his imagination, it was the little town. It was this kind of dream Brody. It was his return to the shtetl of his childhood. But when we talk about his non-fiction, I think it's really important to remember that it's not really entirely non-fiction. It's creative. It's led by memory. It's led by feeling. It's led by nostalgia, and it's very impressionistic. And it's certainly not driven by an urge purely towards facts, put it like that. It's non-fiction driven by feeling. So he's
Roth's breakthrough novel was Job in 1930, and it was a critical and commercial success. It was translated into 7 languages. It brought him an international profile. The influential American journalist and broadcaster Dorothy Thompson translated it into English. It was a book of the month in the U.S. Marlene Dietrich said it was her favorite novel. Why do you think it was so popular?
I think, it was the first novel he completed that was in this new register, this kind of richer, more lyrical, sadder, more nostalgic register. It was the first one that was really written about the world that he remembered so fondly. Formally, it's the most satisfying. His earlier books tended to be, I think Michael Hoffman said they were beset by a charming inattentiveness. He often literally was kind of making them up on the hoof, because they were running, first of all, in newspaper serialization, and he was still finishing them while they, as he said once.
Yeah, with the Radetzky March, he was still writing. It was a very Dickensian kind of image.
Exactly. He said something to Stefan Zweig about that, about having the hot breath of time breathing down my neck, trying to finish it when it was already being published. He took more time over Job, and it was formally satisfying in that it had more of a kind of pleasing structure. Quite often his earlier books stopped quite abruptly, almost like he'd got bored of them. They're still very enjoyable in their ways, but you don't really read them necessarily for formal satisfaction. Rebellion is great. Others are kind of a bit more hit and miss. Anyway, Job, I think those are some of the factors. The other is that it's so emotionally involving. It's beautiful, it's so sad, it's so emotionally engaging, and it's unusually, for Roth, it's so hopeful. You can't but be moved. It's so sad for much of it, but people say that the ending, I won't give the ending away, but people say that the ending can seem contrived, implausible, unrealistic, and maybe it is all of those things, and yet somehow it's deeply moving. And I suggest in the book that maybe that's because we can actually feel the author's own need for hope at that point, because he needed hope so deeply, so powerfully by that time in his life, and he needed a miracle. And just to come full circle back to Brody briefly, one of the ideas that stuck with him from the Hasidic world he grew up in was the idea, the possibility of miracles, and he always hoped that miracles might actually happen.
So, and 2 years later came his masterpiece, the Radetzky March, and it's as if all his themes coalesce, and you write at great length and admiration for this novel. What makes it so wonderful?
It's a world. It's a world in itself. It's twice the length of any of his other novels, and more than twice the length of most of them. It's beautiful. It's an elegy for Austria-Hungary. It's his most fully realized work. I keep quoting Michael Hoffman, but he's so quotable. He says
Hoffman was his translator, and ultimately he brought Joseph Roth to the English-speaking world.
Yeah, absolutely. He says that the Radetzky March is done in oils, as he puts it. It's it's like an old oil painting. It's a beautiful old thing. It's just so rich, sad, poignant, haunted by fate, haunted by memory, haunted by death, and it's an odd book in that it's, again, formally, it's not driven by plots. I say something in the book about how
it's like somebody wandering home drunk or something.
That's exactly the line. The plot weaves like a homebound drunkard, I say, and yet somehow it's compelling. And then I said that if there is a propulsive force to the plot, it's the main character, Karl Joseph von Trotter's urge towards the next drink. It's all, because it is Roth's first conspicuously alcoholic novel. It's a book that's soaked in drink. But it's full of these wonderful vignettes. It's, for all that the plot isn't really linear, it's more a series of immersive set pieces, which he does so wonderfully well. So there's the scene where Karl Joseph is forced by Austrian etiquette to pay a visit to the newly bereaved husband of the woman he was having an affair with, who died giving birth to Karl Joseph's child. I mean, terribly, exquisitely fraught scene, beautifully managed by Roth. And this wonderful scene towards the end where the news of the assassination of Franz Ferdinand is reported at this party being held out in a castle out on the Austrian periphery, and the news gets around, and the party kind of degenerates into some people being terribly upset, but the Hungarians being raucously happy. And again, just one beautifully handled set piece after another. He writes with such control. Maybe that's it, because sometimes earlier in his writing, some of the control, sometimes you feel like characters are mistimed a little bit. Their entry can be mistimed. You can feel that he was writing in a hurry sometimes. He was clearly brilliant, but writing in a hurry. The control in the Radetzky March is never off. He's always just on point. Yeah.
Roth, I mean, you not only wrote a book called The Wandering Jews, but that seemed to define him. I mean, not only he loved hotels, he referred to, this is a great line where he refers to living in a flat, and he said it's like living in a crypt.
Yeah.
But he only wants to be, hotels. But he says, I'm a stranger in this town, and that's why I'm so at home there, and Eastern Jews have no home anywhere, but their graves may be found in every cemetery. Do you think ultimately Paris was as close to a home for him? Because, I mean, he loved cities, he loved big cities, he loved Vienna, then Berlin, but Paris seemed to have a special place.
Certainly when he arrived in Paris in spring of 1925, that was the apex of his happiness, and it was very short-lived. We're talking about a few months, really. But he felt a profound spiritual homecoming. He wrote some letters to his editor at the Frankfurter Zeitung, for the newspaper for which he wrote his journalism in the feuilleton form. His editor, Benno Reifenberg, was a recipient of many letters, and he wrote some at that point, which are absolutely rhapsodic, in a voice, a register that we never really see again, saying, you must come to Paris. It's the center it's the capital of the civilized world. It's, it's this, it's that, it's so beautiful. At that point, he basically fled Germany. He was disgusted by the direction that Germany was heading in. He felt so depressed and angered by that. And then he came to Paris, and he felt that Paris was fluid, relaxed, beautiful. He felt that he could be himself there. It felt like an absolute homecoming for a while. He was promised, or felt that he was promised, believed he was promised, the role of Paris correspondent for the Frankfurter Zeitung. Now, a tempestuous character, abrasive character that he was, I imagine I know that he upset various people. This job that he felt that he had been promised was then given to someone else, and he felt absolutely betrayed. He'd probably said the wrong thing to the wrong person. He hated the editor, the overall editor at the newspaper, and was quite explicit about this. I mean, that's not the way to get on in newspapers. So he didn't get the job that he thought would earn him a niche in Paris, and that was the beginning of his reacquaintance with, as he put it, the Black Depths. That was
which is drinking more.
Drinking, yeah.
And it wasn't only hotels. Roth seemed to crave company. So he'd do his writing in cafes and bars. And you have this great line where he's meeting friends at a cafe. And then he says, I want to work now, gentlemen. Feel free to talk. And then somebody says, well, it's not going to disturb you. And he says, no, it'll distract me if you don't talk. I mean, it's so unusual. What do you make of that?
It's so unusual. And for me, a writer who requires absolute silence at home, and not even silence, but also just, if my children are at home and I feel like I might get interrupted, I feel distracted. He was absolutely the opposite. I think he probably found silence oppressive. I think he liked the white noise of kind of human conversation, interaction around him. I think he found that actually quite relaxing. But also, he was someone who was always looking, yeah, he was a journalist primarily before he was a novelist. And he was always looking for human stories. And he got in the habit of working in cafes. And he would write these feuilletons, these kind of half-page impressionistic sketches about these stories that he would pick up in the cities that he frequented, Vienna, Berlin, Paris. And I think sitting at a cafe table, he had access to briefly opening windows into neighboring people's lives. I think he could sit there, he could have a little eavesdrop, he would kind of pick things up, he would talk with friends for a little bit, and then he'd feel inspired, he'd want to get back to his work, he'd write a bit, then he'd talk a bit more. He could move between those modes very readily.
Roth's volatile and demanding character, I mean, basically his alcoholism made it hard for him to have lasting friendships. Walter Benjamin was not particularly fond of him, but he did have an important and long-term relationship with Stefan Zweig that began in September 1927, and as you say, would shape the remainder of his life. In what way was this friendship important to them both? Or to each of them, maybe is a better way to put it.
It was very important to each of them in different ways. I mean, it was a very imbalanced friendship in that they were from very different backgrounds. Zweig was from a wealthy, established kind of Viennese middle-class background. And Roth, as we know, was from kind of, a relatively impoverished town on the fringes. But for all that Zweig was well established in kind of socioeconomic terms, they both knew that that Roth was the better writer. Zweig would say that. Roth would say that as well. So they kind of fed off each other. Zweig was besotted with Roth. I mean, it's almost abject at times, however rude Roth was to him. There's a letter where he says, "However rude you are, however much you push me away, you will never stop me loving you." There was a great platonic love there. And Zweig to Roth was a couple of things. He was a source of calm, serene counsel. He was also a source of money. And this was fundamental. There came a point shortly after Friedel descended into severe mental illness, where Roth started tapping up his friends for money. And Zweig, who was very wealthy, was someone he went back to again and again. And Zweig would give him money because he had money, and he felt that he wanted to keep a genius, as he referred to him, alive and in funds. But there came a point where he started saying, "I'm not going to give you any more money. I'm going to pay for you to go to a drying out clinic instead." But he did. He kept giving him money.
So politically, Roth, and you've alluded to this earlier, but Roth seems to have been more astute about what was happening around him than his contemporaries, or certainly in terms of acting on it. I mean, he's the first to mention Adolf Hitler in his debut 1923 novel, The Spider's Web. And then, as you pointed out, when the anti-democratic right-wing Hindenburg was elected in 1925, who later became the enabler for Hitler becoming chancellor, Roth left Berlin for Paris in 1925, as you said, and he said, "I know what will follow." And then not long afterwards, Roth had a very long solitary trip to Russia in 1926, which put an end to his flirtation with the Russian experiment, because he thought by eliminating religion, it would put an end to anti-Semitism. But nonetheless, I mean, as to quote Walter Benjamin, he said Roth had come to Russia as a nearly confirmed Bolshevik and was leaving as a royalist. So at a time when a large part of the European left was still backing the USSR, was this decision of Roth's surprising?
I think it wasn't surprising in that I don't think he was a nearly confirmed Bolshevik. I think he, in his early years as a journalist, he was known as, in German, der Rote Roth. We say Joseph Roth, that's kind of anglicizing. I follow Michael Hoffman's example. He says, I translate him into English. I call him Joseph Roth. His name was Joseph Roth. His byline in the newspapers in the early 20s was der Rote Roth, the Red Roth, because he was seen as, very left-wing, very red. I think it was a bit of a put on, a bit of an act. I think his sympathies were certainly with the oppressed, the impoverished. I think, and I say somewhere in the book, I think he was one of those socialists who prefers to agitate on behalf of the poor from such distance, from sufficient distance that he doesn't have to smell them. He was...
Yes, Roth has a great line where he says, I would die for the poor, but I just don't want to live with them.
Exactly. He was basically a snob. I mean, he grew up a Habsburg royalist. He kind of swung away from that as a young man, became, quite an outspoken socialist, it seems, but I'm not sure he truly, truly believed it. I think he wanted the Soviet experiment to work, but was skeptical before he got there, had a good look around and left convinced it wasn't going to work. And the main reason I think that he was convinced of that, and the main reason it really didn't sit easily with him, was that he was fundamentally a free thinker. He was an individualist. He believed in individual freedom. He was a liberal, basically, and he saw.
But also, it seemed to be that his friend Soma Morgenstern pointed out that Roth was the first to smell anti-Semitic motives in the slander against Trotsky, and to denounce them as such. So I just wonder how. I mean, Roth has a kind of prescience or perception that enables him to speak out or act, or.
He certainly did. I mean, how he always did it, I don't always know, but he could see the writing on the wall much sooner than many people. He said, I think as early as 1923, I think it was, he said, Germany is a tragedy, not a passing fancy. Yeah. He was reporting on Hitler's trial in early 1924, and he said, something like the tombs of world history are opening in Munich, and all the corpses we thought safely interred are now stepping out again. He could see where things were heading. And one of the great points of contention in his relationship with Stefan Zweig was that Zweig was kind of hedging his bets for far too long, as Roth saw it. He tried to retain, even after Hitler had come to power, Zweig tried to retain a readership in Nazified Germany, which Roth thought was unforgivable. He thought, you've got to get out. You've got to know that the writing is on the wall for us here. And this was one of the things that depressed him, I think, actually, that he was so short-sighted, so prescient. He says in a letter somewhere that I know what someone else is going to say before they say it. And he found people so predictable at times that it was actually quite depressing. He said, all I can do is talk very cleverly with other very clever people. But,
So Joseph Roth was only 44 when he died in Paris in 1939, and you vividly describe his unraveling, both physical and emotional, and the ravages of alcoholism while still managing to write. In January 1939, he received a letter from Dorothy Thompson, who not only translated Job, but was regarded by some as the first lady of American journalism, and was recognized by Time magazine in 1939 as equal in influence to Eleanor Roosevelt. So on behalf of PEN America, Thompson invites Roth to a World Congress of Writers in New York that May. Roth agreed. A cousin of his who'd managed to get out of Buchenwald and to the UK was intending to move to America, and he writes about how they'll meet up. And I can't help doing a what if, like what if Roth had gone to New York, another big city, which he might have loved, and what if they managed to, get him dried out? I mean, what might have happened to him? What might he have written? I mean, do you ever go there? I mean, I know you're embedded in the unraveling part, but I just, and I read something like that, I never knew about that detail, that he had this invitation and could have gone to the US, which so many who were desperate to do.
Yeah. I love this idea that at this critical point, Roth actually managed to stop drinking. And, you know, he was born in 1894. We can picture him actually living on into the 1970s, maybe settling in New York, maybe writing about Jews on the Lower East Side in the 1960s alongside Bernard Malamud or something, or, you know, writing occasional contributions to the New Yorker. I love this idea. I mean, it feels, given the state he was in, it feels purely in the realms of fantasy.
I'm afraid
But
yeah.
the other possibility, though, and one of the things he did have in mind, was that he wanted to get to Hollywood, which seems bizarre, but maybe not so bizarre.
Well, not so much. I
not
mean,
so
there were
bizarre.
so many Germans in
There were,
Hollywood
yeah.
at that point.
And he was working on some treatments, I think, in the mid-30s. So, if anything, that seems like the what if that maybe
What if might have gone,
he
never
could
mind,
have-
skip
he
New
could
York.
have got
and
to
go
LA.
the-
He could
yeah,
have maybe
could have gone
written the film treatment, the screenplay that worked, and maybe that would have been the way forward. But he would only have drunk the money, I'm sure. So, yeah.
Quick question. I was, except it's not a quick question, but I feel like we have to at least touch on it, which is, I mean, by that May, he had drank himself to death. He had a Catholic funeral, so I just have to circle back just for a moment
Yeah.
about Roth's relationship with religion was vexatious. I mean, how do you see it?
I mean, two things to say there. One, I think his attitude towards religion is fascinating and fundamental to him. I'm not convinced he even believed in God. What I concluded was that he believed in the value of believing in God, if that seems like a reasonable distinction. I think that he knew that the idea of having faith gave him drive, purpose, meaning. It kind of tethered him to the world in some way. He said something to one of his friends, Hungarian friend, Joseph von Cifra, the filmmaker. They met outside St. Stephen's Cathedral in Vienna, and Roth said something like, "If God resides anywhere, it's here," pointing to the cathedral. He said, "Do you believe in God? I don't, and yes, I still pray to him." And I think,
Roth said he still prays to him?
yeah, he said, "I don't believe in God, and yet I still act like he exists." I think he felt that, I think, without the idea that a God might exist, I think maybe he had nothing. I mean, I think it gave him the possibility of meaning. It's something to drive towards. I talk about this tension between flight and pursuit. He was in endless flight, but the idea that you might be able to work your way towards finding God and towards finding a home, finding a niche, a kind of homecoming, these were two pursuits that he worked towards. I'm not sure he ever quite believed he would find either, but the trying gave him purpose, gave him something to aim for. The other thing, specifically as regards Catholicism, you know, there was a great, well, I don't know about a great tradition, but a tradition of Jews converting to Christianity, you know, as a social tactic, a tactic in a bid towards assimilation. So Roth, we don't know whether he actually converted, whether he was baptized. Some people thought he was, others thought he wasn't. There's a story that as he lay, when he had his kind of fatal collapse in a cafe in Paris, he whispered, "I have not been baptized." He'd told people previously he had been, but he felt the need to confess that he hadn't been. But Catholicism appealed to him in numerous ways, and I list my conclusions. Let me just find it, because I can't quite remember how I put it, but and I put it slightly more articulately in the book than I would manage to if I'm trying to remember. I say, perhaps his Catholicism, in inverted commas, reduces to these factors. The aesthete in him was seduced by its imagery and incense, the snob in him by its nobility, the politician in him by its role in his scheme to reinstall the Habsburg monarchy, the internationalist in him by its transcendence of borders, the sinner in him by the absolution of confession, and the lost child in him by its provision of father figures. But in his essence, he was always an Eastern Jew, and it was only among his fellow Ostjuden that he felt at home. I think that sums his Catholicism up for me, really.
Thank you. I just felt we